Welcome, this is u1c1a4 Evaluating Experimental Designs. You will be able to, by the end of this lesson, evaluate the criteria for designing a good experiment and what we call a fair test. You will analyze 3 different experiments in this lesson, and you're going to answer several questions about each. The questions include, what is the manipulated variable? What's the responding variable? How are the variables being measured? And is the experiment a fair test? For hints about each experiment and how to answer each of those questions, it'll show up in the bottom in red. So let's do one example together. Here's the example experiment that we'll go through to make sure that you understand how to do it, and then you can use this as a model to go back and answer the ones that you have to out of the book. How does the age of the runners affect how fast they're able to run the mile? A scientist wanted to see how the age of runners affected the time it takes them to run a mile. The scientists had groups of 11-year-olds, 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds run a mile and time them in minutes and seconds. Each group was half boys and half girls, except for the 13-year-old group. The 13-year-old group was all girls because the boys would not run. The students ran on the same track and on the same day. The first question is, what is the question the experiment is designed to answer? To answer this, look at the initial question. This is what the experiment is all about. How does the age of runners affect how fast they're able to run the mile? The next question is, what is the manipulated variable, and what were the values used? Remember, the manipulated variable is what the scientist changes on purpose. This is what the experiment is really all about. So it'll always be in the experimental question, and the specific values are what did they actually test. In this experiment they tested the age of the runners. That was the manipulated variable, and the values were 11-year-olds, 12-year-olds, and 13-year-olds. They could have chose any values for the specific values, but they chose 11, 12, and 13-year-olds. Next question is, what is the responding variable and how is it measured? Remember, the responding variable is the variable that's being measured. It's the variable that changes as a result of the manipulated variable changing. So the manipulated variable, again, was the age of the runners, and the thing the scientists measured that changed as a result was how fast they could run the mile. So how fast they could run the mile was a responding variable. Again, this one will also be in the experimental question. What were the controlled variables? The controlled variables are the things the scientists kept the same. So in this experiment, they kept the same, that all the students ran on the same track and all ran the same time of day. Probably the most important thing to understand for this lesson is, were there any other variables changed, and is this a fair test? Remember, for it to be a fair test, only one manipulated variable and one responding variable can change. If the scientist allows other factors to change, then it's not a fair test. In this example, the 13-year-old group was not half boys and half girls. It was all girls because the boys wouldn't run that day. So this is not a fair test because that was allowed to change. The sex of the girls, the sex of the members of the group was allowed to change as opposed to keeping that the same like it was in all of the other groups. So this was not a fair test. What you're going to do now is you're going to read through pages 25 to 27, and as you read through those pages, you're going to answer the questions about the 3 different experiments. It'll be the same questions you'll be answering. So what was the experimental question, what's the manipulated variable, responding variable, controlled variable, and it is a fair test. Be sure to use the pictures to help you answer it, because it will. And if you're having trouble, feel free to go back and look at the video reminders to this video for reminders for how to do it.